Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of the Alamo, 1836. The morning light in San Antonio de Bexar was brittle. A pale sun crept over the horizon, its warmth smothered by the lingering chill of a Texas winter. The air was still, save for the slow creak of wooden shutters in the breeze, and the far-off splash of the San Antonio River against its muddy banks. Above the low adobe buildings and mission walls, a ragged flag snapped in the wind. It bore a single defiant word, Alamo. The sound of boots on dust echoed in the courtyard, mingling with the occasional ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Men moved with a peculiar urgency, not the easy swagger of frontiersmen, but the deliberate pace of soldiers and volunteers who knew the odds. Some carried powder kegs, others hauled rough-hewn timber to reinforce the already crumbling defences. A few muttered in Spanish, most in English, and more than one voice carried a Kentucky drawl or the clipped tones of the Carolinas. They were a patchwork force, Texian rebels, Tejano allies, adventurers from far-off states, drawn together by the promise of liberty and the threat of annihilation. In 1836, Texian was the term most commonly used to describe the Anglo-American settlers and other non-Hispanic residents of Mexican Texas who took part in the Revolution. Texan was also in use, but it didn't become the dominant word until after Texas joined the United States in 1845. At the time of the Texas Revolution, Texian had a specific cultural and political meaning. It marked someone as part of the rebel community, distinct from the Tejano population, Hispanic Texans of Mexican descent, and from Mexican citizens more broadly. It was also a way to emphasize the territory's identity as something separate from both Mexico and the United States, at least during its short life as the Republic of Texas, 1836 to 1845. By the mid to late 19th century, Texian faded out in everyday speech, and Texan became the standard, partly because it was shorter, and partly because it matched the pattern of other US state demonyms. Let us return to the Alamo, though. The year was 1836. The rebellion against Mexican rule had erupted only months earlier, and for a time the Texians had won improbable victories. But now the tide was turning. President and General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the Napoleon of the West, was marching north with a disciplined army and a burning desire to crush the uprising before it could gain a foothold. To him, the rebels in Texas were not freedom fighters. They were pirates, outlaws, traitors, and the punishment for treason was death. The Alamo itself was no fortress, not in the European sense. It was a former mission San Antonio de Valero, with thick adobe walls, a weathered chapel, and an open courtyard once meant for prayer and crops, not cannon fire. Its perimeter was irregular, patched together with palisades of timber and earthen embankments. In the courtyard, the chapel's stone facade rose like a defiant sentinel, scarred by time and neglect. Its bells no longer called the faithful. They had been silenced by war. Colonel William B. Travis stood near the north wall, surveying the men at work. 26 years old, with reddish hair, a firm jaw, and eyes that betrayed both resolve and fatigue, Travis had a lawyer's command of words and a soldier's stubbornness. At his side, James Bowie leaned heavily on a chair, his face pale with illness. Bowie, famed knife fighter, land speculator, and man of the frontier, had been struck down not by bullet or blade, but by disease, possibly typhoid. He could no longer lead from the wall, yet his very presence seemed to steady the men. And then there was Davy Crockett, the Tennessee frontiersman, former congressman, and folk hero, whose coonskin cap was more legend than reality. Crockett had brought with him a small company of sharpshooters, their long rifles worn but deadly accurate. In the evening light, his drawl carried a reassuring ease, though behind his humour lay the same grim awareness everyone shared. When Santa Anna came, there would be no relief force in time. The days before the siege were filled with preparation. Powder was measured out into horn flasks, muskets were cleaned and reloaded, and the few artillery pieces were positioned along the walls. 4-pounders, 6-pounders, a few heavier pieces, salvaged from earlier fights. The largest, an 18-pounder, sat grimly in place, its bronze barrel dulled by smoke and weather. Each shot it fired would shake the very air, but ammunition for it was scarce. Outside the walls, riders came and went, some carrying desperate pleas for reinforcements, others returning empty-handed. One such courier arrived on the evening of February 23rd, his horse lathered and sides heaving. Breathless, he reported what many had feared. Santa Anna's advance guard was less than a day away. Behind them trailed thousands of veteran soldiers, disciplined and armed with muskets, bayonets and light artillery. That night, the defenders moved like shadows along the parapets, checking lines of fire and shoring up weak points. In the courtyard, the flicker of lanterns cast long wavering shadows across the chapel facade. Some men prayed, others wrote hurried letters, to wives, to children, to brothers they would never see again. The scratching of quills on paper was oddly loud against the night air, broken only by the cough of a sick man or the low murmur of voices. Dawn on the 23rd brought the first sight of dust on the southern horizon. By midday, the lead elements of the Mexican army had entered San Antonio. Scarlet tunics and blue trousers marched in tight formation, muskets gleaming in the winter sun. Drums rolled, a deep, steady cadence that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Then came the flag, green, white, and red, with the emblem of the Mexican eagle, carried high, a visible promise of the Republic's authority. Santa Anna himself rode at the head, resplendent in a bright blue uniform heavy with gold braid. He cut the figure of a man utterly convinced of his own destiny. The soldiers who followed him numbered in the thousands, their bayonets catching the light like a sea of steel. The sound was as much a presence as the sight. The creak of leather, the metallic chink of arms, the barked commands in Spanish. By late afternoon, the Mexican forces had surrounded the mission. A messenger under a white flag approached the north wall, bearing a simple demand: unconditional surrender. Travis's reply was equally simple, a single shot from the Alamo's largest cannon, sending a plume of smoke into the fading light. The shot did no real harm to the encircling troops, but its message was unmistakable. There would be no surrender. That night, the siege began in earnest. Mexican artillery opened fire, their light cannon throwing iron balls that slammed into the walls with dull, bone-deep thuds. Chips of adobe flew like shrapnel, dusting the defenders' hair and shoulders. Return fire from the Alamo was sparse, each shot carefully measured to conserve powder and shot. In the darkness, the glow of distant campfires ringed the mission like a necklace of embers, a constant reminder that escape was impossible. For the men inside, the hours were filled with a strange blend of monotony and sudden violence. At times there was nothing to do but wait. Wait for the next barrage, the next shouted challenge from the Mexican lines, the next attempt to close the distance. Then, in an instant, the quiet would shatter. A musket crack, a shout, the crash of a cannonball into the walls. And all the while, the defenders knew that each passing day brought Santa Anna's main force closer to readiness. The Mexican general was in no hurry. He could wait, tightening the noose until the men inside the Alamo were too exhausted, too starved, too few to resist. But what he had not counted on, what he perhaps could not understand, was that the very hopelessness of the situation only steeled the resolve of those within. In those first days of siege, life in the Alamo took on a brutal rhythm. Men snatched sleep in snatches, their dreams haunted by the thud of distant drums. Meals were meagre: cornmeal, dried beef, whatever could be spared, eaten quickly, often standing at the wall. The smell of black powder hung constantly in the air, clinging to clothing and skin. And in the cold hours before dawn, when the campfires outside burned low, some swore they could hear the faint strains of music drifting from the Mexican lines. Bugles, guitars, the occasional mournful song. Whether meant to taunt or to humanize, it reminded the defenders that the men on the other side were flesh and blood too. Yet the gulf between them was unbridgeable now. The Texians fought for what they saw as liberty, the right to govern themselves, free from decrees handed down from Mexico City. The Mexican troops fought for the unity of their republic, to put down rebellion before it spread. There would be no compromise. By the fifth day, Travis knew reinforcements were unlikely. He took up his pen and wrote a letter, one that would later become famous. It was addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, and it was as much a declaration as a plea. He wrote of the siege, of the need for aid, and of his determination to hold the Alamo, victory or death. The words were bold, but they were not empty. Every man within those walls understood them to be literal. And so the standoff continued, the defenders watching the enemy lines, the enemy watching them in turn. The air was heavy with the unspoken knowledge that the storm would come soon. Whether it would break in the dead of night or with the first light of dawn, none could say. But when it did, the Battle of the Alamo would become more than a fight for a mission in Texas. It would become a fight for an idea, one that neither side was willing to relinquish. The days dragged on beneath a constant haze of powder smoke. By now the defenders knew the rhythm of the siege by heart, the sharp crack of Mexican muskets from the rooftops of San Antonio, the dull thud of cannon shot striking adobe, the whistle of iron fragments spinning through the air like angry hornets. Each impact chipped away at the Alamo's crumbling walls, but also at the nerves of the men who stood behind them. The Mexican army had tightened its noose. Pickets and sentries encircled the mission in a perfect ring. Any movement outside those walls, even for water or firewood, risked death or capture. Mexican sharpshooters took every opportunity to fire on exposed defenders. The courtyard became a place of careful movement, a man keeping low as he darted from cover to cover. In the chapel, where once prayers had been whispered, the benches were pushed aside to make room for powder stores, muskets, and the wounded. Bowie, fever burning in his chest, now commanded from his cot. The once feared duelist lay swaddled in blankets, coughing into a rag, issuing orders in a rasping voice. His presence still carried weight, though he could barely lift himself. His knife, the legendary Bowie knife, lay within reach on a table beside him, a silent promise that even in illness he would not go quietly. The Bowie knife was as much a symbol as it was a weapon, a broad, heavy-bladed fighting knife, with a clipped point, often over a foot long from hilt to tip. Its edge was honed for both slicing and thrusting, and the thick spine gave it the strength to parry a sword or break bone with a single blow. The brass crossguard curved to catch an opponent's blade, while the handle, usually of wood, horn, or bone, was shaped to lock into the hand even when slick with sweat or blood. Though designs varied, the knife credited to James Bowie became legendary after his famous sandbar fight of 1827, when he used it to deadly effect in a brutal melee. From that day, the Bowie knife was carried by frontiersmen, soldiers, and adventurers across the American West, a tool for the wilderness, a weapon for close combat, and a name forever linked with defiance. Crockett and his Tennesseans held the palisade along the south wall, where the wooden barricades were weakest. Their long rifles, some near as tall as the men themselves, could reach far beyond the range of the smooth-bore muskets carried by the Mexican infantry. The long rifles carried by Crockett and his Tennesseans, often Pennsylvania or Kentucky patterns, were precision weapons built for the frontier, with barrels stretching 40 inches or more and deep, spiral rifling cut into the bore. This rifling imparted spin to the ball, allowing an experienced marksman to hit a man-sized target well beyond 200 yards, sometimes out to 300, far surpassing the effective range of the smoothbore muskets used by the Mexican infantry. Those muskets, typically Brown Bess style or similar European designs, could fire faster and deliver a massed volley with devastating effect at close range, but beyond about 75 yards they were notoriously inaccurate, their round balls wandering unpredictably. The long rifles took longer to load. The tight-fitting ball and patch had to be rammed home with care. But in the hands of Crockett's sharpshooters, they could pick off officers, artillery crews, or anyone who exposed themselves, forcing the Mexican troops to keep low and move with caution. At the Alamo, where every shot counted and ammunition was precious, that extra reach and accuracy turned each Tennessean rifleman into a lethal, long-range thorn in Santa Anna's side. Crockett would stand with one boot on a firing step of the south wall, peering through the sights with a steady calm. When his rifle cracked, it sent a puff of white smoke curling in the cool air. And somewhere across the way, a red-coated figure crumpled to the dirt. At night, the Mexican artillery lobbed sporadic shells into the compound. They burst with a flash and a hollow, concussive boom that rattled the teeth and showered fragments of stone and iron. The defenders learned to read the arc of the incoming rounds by the faint, hissing whistle they made in flight. Some men joked that you could tell if it was going to hit you by whether you heard it at all. Gallows humour became a thin shield against fear. It was during one of these tense nights that Travis gathered his officers. The lanterns flickered in the draughts that slipped through the chapel doors. His voice was steady as he laid out the truth. The enemy was growing in number. Their attacks were probing for weaknesses. If reinforcements came at all, they would be too few. The choice was simple: hold the Alamo to the last man, or attempt to break out and be cut down in the open. Not a man present suggested retreat. The following day, Mexican troops advanced under the cover of artillery fire, testing the walls. Shouts in Spanish rose over the roar of cannon. "Viva Santa Anna!" The defenders returned fire with grim precision. Each musket shot a deliberate expenditure of their dwindling powder. A few attackers reached the base of the wall, only to be driven back by bursts of grape shot, iron balls and scrap metal packed into cannon barrels, turning them into massive shotguns. At such close range, grape shot did not wound. It destroyed. The siege entered its second week. Inside, the defenders were gaunt from sleepless nights and meagre rations. Water had to be rationed. Barrels in the courtyard were kept covered against musket fire. The smell of unwashed bodies, gunpowder, and sickness hung heavy in the air. Some men showed the glassy stare of exhaustion, moving mechanically, doing their duty without thought. Others found strength in the smallest rituals, sharpening a blade, oiling a musket, saying the same short prayer before stepping to the wall. On the evening of March 5th, the Mexican bombardment ceased. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. Men glanced at one another, uneasy. The absence of gunfire was not mercy. It was preparation. That night, as the campfires outside glowed brighter than usual, Travis assembled the garrison in the courtyard. In the lantern light, his face was drawn but resolute. He spoke of honour, of duty, of the cause for which they had taken up arms. Then, with the tip of his sword, He drew a line in the dirt before him. He told them plainly, those who wished to stay and fight to the death should cross the line. Those who wished to leave could try, but the risk was their own. One by one, men stepped across. Crockett crossed with an easy stride. Bowie, too ill to stand, asked his cot to be carried over. Only one man, Moses Rose, a Frenchman, chose to slip away into the night. No one begrudged him. The rest knew they would face the morning together. In the Mexican camp, Santa Anna made his own preparations. He planned to storm the mission at first light, when the shadows were long and the defenders weary from the night watch. Columns of infantry were assembled and briefed, scaling ladders to breach the walls, reserves to follow, cavalry to encircle and prevent any escape. Buglers rehearsed the call for the assault, the shrill, relentless notes that would signal the attack. The air before dawn on March 6th was sharp and cold. In the darkness, the defenders stood their posts, peering into the gloom beyond the walls. Somewhere in the stillness, a single drum began to beat. Then another. The sound grew until it was a rolling thunder, punctuated by the high, piercing notes of the bugles. From the mist, shapes emerged, ranks of soldiers, bayonets fixed, advancing at the double. The first wave came from the north. Muskets cracked from the parapets, flashes lighting the dim morning. Men shouted, reloaded, fired again. The Mexican soldiers pressed forward, climbing ladders, clutching at the rough stone, trying to gain a foothold. Defenders shoved ladders away, sending men tumbling into the dust. A cannon fired down the length of the wall, its blast throwing men backward in a tangle of limbs. But the waves kept coming. From the east, another column surged. Crockett's Tennesseans met them with deadly long-range fire, each shot dropping a man before he reached the wall. Yet for every soldier who fell, another stepped over his body. Shouts of "Arriba!" rose through the smoke as more ladders went up. Travis was at the north wall when a musket ball struck him in the forehead. He dropped without a sound. The men around him barely had time to register before the next ladder clattered against the wall, and another wave of attackers began to climb. The defenders fought hand to hand now, musket butts swinging like clubs, knives flashing in the half-light. The sharp ring of steel on steel, the heavy thud of bodies hitting earth, the ragged cries of the wounded. It was chaos, and yet each man fought with a strange clarity, knowing there was no retreat, no rescue. The Mexicans gained the walls. The fight spilled into the courtyard. Bowie's room became a last redoubt, men firing through the doorway until the press of attackers burst inside. In the chapel, smoke choked the air, making eyes water and lungs burn. Crockett and his men fought near the altar, rifles empty now, swinging them as clubs. The defenders were being pushed back, step by step. The sound was deafening, gunfire, shouting, the clash of blades, the crash of timber as barricades gave way. Still they fought, still they refused to yield. And in the grey light, filtering through the smoke, it became clear. The Alamo was falling. The courtyard was a maelstrom of smoke, dust, and blood. The Mexican troops now poured in from every direction, their bayonets glinting in the flicker of muzzle flashes. The defenders, exhausted, bleeding, and running low on ammunition, fought on with whatever lay to hand. A man swung a hatchet into the press before a bayonet punched through his ribs. Another smashed a musket butt into an attacker's jaw, only to vanish beneath the crush of bodies. In the chapel, the air was thick with the acrid sting of black powder. The flickering light from the gunfire revealed faces blackened with soot, eyes wide in the haze. Crockett's Tennesseans had fallen back to this last refuge, their rifles now little more than clubs. The sharp crack of a pistol, the ring of a knife on steel. Each sound was swallowed by the greater roar outside. Bowie's sick room was among the first to be overrun. Bowie lay propped against rough pillows, his skin ashen and slick with sweat. the fever still raging through his body. The air in his small room was thick, the mingled stench of sickness, gunpowder, and the acrid smoke that seeped in from the courtyard beyond. His breathing was ragged, but his eyes burned with a cold, unwavering defiance. A brace of pistols lay within reach, each one loaded alongside his long, broad-bladed knife, the weapon that had carried his name across the frontier. The door shuddered under the weight of the first blow. Then another. The wood splintered, and a rush of red-coated soldiers burst inside, bayonets fixed. Bowie's arm came up like a striking snake. The first pistol cracked, its report deafening in the confined space, and a soldier pitched forward, clutching his chest. The second shot came a heartbeat later, tearing into another man's shoulder. They faltered, the smell of burnt powder blooming in the room, but only for an instant. The survivors surged forward, shouting, steel flashing in the smoke. Bowie gripped his knife, the edge gleaming in the dim light. And when the first bayonet thrust toward him, he swept it aside and drove the blade upward into the attacker's gut. The man screamed, crumpling at Bowie's side, but the others closed in. Bayonets punched through blanket and flesh alike, driving deep. Still, Bowie struck back, slashing, twisting steel, refusing to yield until sheer weight and steel overcame him. He died, not as a sick man in bed, but as the fighter he had always been, leaving blood on the floor and fear in the eyes of those who killed him. The Mexican soldiers advanced through the compound methodically, pressing the defenders into ever smaller pockets of resistance. Those who could no longer reload fought with sabres, with knives, with bare hands. The smoke hung low, making every breath a rasp. Above it all came the unceasing roll of drums from the plaza outside, the heartbeat of Santa Anna's triumph. The last stand of Davy Crockett and his Tennesseans unfolded in the choking gloom of the Alamo's chapel, where the smoke from musket fire hung so thick it turned men into shifting shadows. The great doors had been battered from their hinges, and the enemy poured through in waves, red and blue uniforms flickering in the strobing light of muzzle flashes. Crockett, bareheaded now, his hair plastered to his brow with sweat, wielded his long rifle like a staff, smashing the heavy walnut stock into the skull of the first soldier who came too close. Around him, his men fought with a desperate fury, bayonets snapping under the weight of bodies, knives flashing, boots slipping in blood. The thunder of gunfire outside was muted here, replaced by the gasps, curses, and wet, meaty sounds of hand-to-hand combat. They were surrounded on all sides, pressed back toward the altar, each step costing another life. Crockett's rifle was broken now, the barrel bent, so he drew his hunting knife and moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who had hunted bear in the dark. He drove the blade up under a man's ribs, then turned to parry a bayonet thrust with the flat of the bent rifle barrel. A Tennessean beside him took a blade in the throat, dropping in a spray of crimson that glistened on the stone floor. Yet still they fought, each man standing over the fallen, buying seconds with his life. When Crockett finally went down, whether from a musket ball in the chest or a half-dozen blades at once, it was in the midst of his enemies, eyes blazing, a man who had promised to fight to the last and kept his word. By the time the smoke cleared, the altar steps were slick with blood, and the silence that followed seemed to mock the violence that had just ended. The battle lasted little more than 90 minutes. When it was over, the Mexican army stood among the ruins, the walls pitted and torn, the ground littered with bodies. No defender was spared. The wounded were dispatched where they lay, the final musket shots echoing off the mission walls like hammer blows. Santa Anna surveyed the scene with cold satisfaction. The victory had been costly. His forces had suffered hundreds of dead and wounded, but the rebellion, he believed, had been dealt a mortal blow. He ordered that the bodies of the defenders be gathered, piled high and set alight. black smoke rose into the Texas sky, carrying with it the scent of burnt powder and human ash. Outside the mission, the few civilians spared from the slaughter were released to carry the tale. Among them was Susanna Dickinson, wife of a defender, sent with her infant daughter to Sam Houston's camp with a grim message. The Alamo had fallen. It was both a warning and a challenge. In the days that followed, word of the stand at the Alamo spread like wildfire. Across Texas, men tightened their grips on rifles and knives, their anger hardening into resolve. Remember the Alamo became the rallying cry of the revolution, not a plea for remembrance, but a call to vengeance. The Mexican victory at the Alamo was, in military terms, absolute. Yet strategically, it proved a miscalculation. The brutality of Santa Anna's assault, the slaughter of every last defender, galvanized Texian resistance rather than crushing it. 6 weeks later, at the Battle of San Jacinto, Sam Houston's forces would catch Santa Anna's army off guard, routing them in a fight that lasted barely 18 minutes. In the chaos, Texian soldiers shouted the words born in blood at the Alamo, words that echoed like cannon fire across the prairie. The mission itself would stand in ruins for decades, a silent witness to what had happened there. Its walls, blackened and scarred, became a shrine to sacrifice, not just for Texans, but for all who saw in it a story of hopeless defiance against overwhelming force. To stand in its courtyard, even today, is to feel the weight of those last moments, the desperate courage, the cost paid in full. History is often measured in victories and defeats, but the Alamo endures because it was both a defeat on the battlefield and a victory in the hearts of those who fought on. It was proof that the will of a few, bound by a cause, can echo far beyond the day they fall. In the years that followed, the Alamo's legacy only deepened. It became a symbol of sacrifice in the face of impossible odds, a legend retold around campfires, in schoolhouses, and in the halls of government. For Texans, it stood as proof that courage could outlive defeat, and for the United States, it foreshadowed the nation's relentless push westward. The ground where Travis, Bowie, Crockett, and their men fell would pass through empires, republics, and finally a statehood, but its meaning never faded. The Alamo's walls, scarred by shot and shell, became hallowed ground, a place where history and identity fused, and where the price of freedom was written in blood for all who would come after. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.